Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy AP Government Series Part 4, where today we will look at the principles of the Constitution, the debate over ratifying the document, 3 required AP foundational documents, and more. So when we left off, we noted how 3 delegates to the Constitutional Convention refused to sign the document, foreshadowing the debate over ratification that was yet to come. Article 7 of the Constitution provided instructions for ratifying the document and this new form of government, requiring 9 out of 13 states for it to take effect. In addition to looking at the debates this entails, we are going to look at principles like separation of powers, checks and balances, who the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were, and some of the articles they wrote to try to persuade public opinion over its ratification. Our first benchmarks describe the impact of separation of powers and checks and balances, and the resulting competitive nature it created over public policy making, one that ensures the principle of limited government. And just a reminder, teachers at this PowerPoint with a wide variety of materials are available at Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers by clicking the link below this video. So we're going to do a brief overview of some of the sections of the Constitution, as we will repeatedly come back to this document throughout the year as it relates to the topics we're learning about. So by the end of this course, you will be experts on this foundational document. The introduction to the Constitution is known as the Preamble, probably the most well-known part. In its opening 3 words, "We the people," we see the concept of popular sovereignty, that the people will be the source of government power, as well as goals such as providing for the common defense, promoting the general welfare, and securing the blessings of liberty, aka natural rights. In our last lesson, we looked at the Articles of Confederation, and one of its big weaknesses that while it could make laws, it had no way to enforce them. This was addressed in the first couple of articles of the Constitution, which created 3 branches of government, including an executive branch whose main job is to enforce the law. We also spoke in a previous lecture about the Enlightenment philosopher Montesquieu, who influenced the constitutional principle of separation of powers into 3 different branches. Your test wants you to know that by listing the powers of the 3 branches in the first 3 articles of the Constitution, the framers were ensuring that no single department would have too much power. Limiting power is a theme throughout this course, and we're going to do in-depth lessons on all 3 branches as they make up a huge portion of your AP exam. But for now, you can see a quick example of the competitive nature that exists over policy in the fact that Congress has the power to declare war, but the president is the commander-in-chief of the military. And this is definitely an issue that we will look at closely down the road. We don't see much going on for the judicial branch, but one of our 12 required must-know Supreme Court cases will change that. In our next principle of the Constitution, checks and balances, we see the power all 3 branches have to slow down or stop the others in case they might be abusing their power. For example, Congress writes laws, but the president can veto them. However, Congress can override that veto. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court, after the case of Marbury versus Madison, oops, I gave away the surprise, the Supreme Court can declare laws unconstitutional. There is probably no better example of checks and balances than impeachment. Now, we often think of the president when we hear impeachment, but it also includes Supreme Court or federal judges and high-ranking officials. And while 2 presidents have been impeached by the House of Reps, they were found not guilty by the Senate. Therefore, they were not removed from office. No president has been. I know what you're thinking, but Nixon quit before he could be. Impeachment has been in the news a lot recently, as the Democratic majority in the House has contemplated bringing charges against President Trump. But it's very unlikely that a required 2/3 majority in the Senate would vote yes, especially as the Republicans are in the majority in the Senate. And yes, we will look at impeachment again down the road when we get into the 3 branches. So, in our next required foundational document for your exam, we will look at Federalist number 51 as it relates to separation of powers and checks and balances. Federalist 51, just like Federalist number 10, which we covered in a previous lesson and we'll look at briefly again today, was written by James Madison, and it explains how checks and balances and separation of powers will protect the people from abuse of power or tyranny, or as Madison said in the essay, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Probably the most famous quote from this document is when Madison writes, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." A shout out to the need for the social contract. And he admits that if angels were to govern, in other words, government can be bad as well, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Well, what are the external controls? As Madison continues, he notes that the people are the external control on the government, and the internal controls are the checks and balances or separation of powers established by the U.S. Constitution. My students will be reading excerpts from this must-know document included in this lesson, and I recommend you do the same. Madison also references another principle of the Constitution and check on government power, which is federalism, the topic of our next lesson. He states that the uniqueness of America's republic lies in the fact that power is divided into two distinct governments, the national and state governments, and then further divided among the branches at both levels, providing double security for the rights of the people. Federalism, or a federal system of government, is the distribution of power between the central or national government and regional, in our case, state governments. Again, the topic of our next lesson. So what is the outcome of separation of powers and federalism? Well, they provide the people, or as AP Central puts it, stakeholders, with multiple access points to influence public policy. Because it's not just the federal and state governments, we also have local governments. In other words, the people and interest groups have many different options to address their problems. In addition to protection provided by checks and balances and federalism, Article 5 of the Constitution provides that changes to the Constitution, called amendments, can be established. So why were some states reluctant to ratify the Constitution? Well, to understand that, we're going to look at two clauses in the Constitution that worried the states. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution laid out the powers of Congress in what are known as enumerated powers. Again, the concept of listing the powers to limit the branches from assuming other powers. However, the last power listed in Article 1, Section 8 is known as the necessary and proper clause. Congress shall have the power to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out their other powers. I'll give you an example. Congress has the power to raise and support the Army and Navy. Does this mean they have the power to draft citizens into the military? Well, it has been interpreted that yes, they do. The necessary and proper clause produces what are referred to as implied powers, which even though they aren't in the Constitution, it's been argued that it is implied that they should have the power to make these laws. This clause has the nickname the Elastic Clause because it's been used by Congress to stretch their powers. And what has been hotly contested over U.S. history is the fact that what might be considered necessary and proper to some might not to others. This will be the topic of our first must-know Supreme Court case, McCulloch versus Maryland, in our next lesson on federalism. Another clause that worried some states is a section of Article 6 of the Constitution known as the Supremacy Clause. In it, it states that the U.S. Constitution and federal laws shall be the supreme law of the land. In other words, if there's a showdown between state and federal laws and constitutions, the feds will win. So with the stage set, let's get into the ratifying debates between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And these are demonstrated in our next foundational documents, in which we are supposed to identify the tensions in Federalist number 10 and a document called Brutus number 1 as they relate to the participatory, pluralist, and elite theories of democracy. Hopefully you covered the Federalists and Anti-Federalists in your U.S. history class, and I have an entire video on these two groups if you want to get a more in-depth understanding. But these are two factions that rose up after the Constitution was sent to the states to ratify, and laid the groundwork for America's first two political parties. Basically, it boils down to the Federalists who favored this new form of government and the Constitution that created it, who wanted a stronger national or central government and the power to address the weaknesses revealed by the Articles of Confederation, versus the Anti-Federalists who opposed the new Constitution and wanted to maintain state sovereignty as it had existed under the Articles. To win support for ratifying the Constitution and put the states and the people's minds at ease, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay wrote what are known as the Federalist Papers, a series of articles under the pseudonym Publius that were originally published in New York newspapers but were republished throughout the U.S. And again, you need to know 4 for your exam, 2 by Madison and 2 by Hamilton, both of whom wrote most of these articles. However, you also need to know one written by the Anti-Federalists, and that is Brutus number 1. Also a pseudonym, and while there is some debate as to the author, historians believe it was a New York delegate, Robert Yates. In it, Brutus warns about the dangers of a powerful central government. The way the Constitution was written, Brutus argues, would provide the central government with quote-unquote uncontrollable power. And to demonstrate this, he points to the necessary and proper and supremacy clauses as a means for the federal government to take away the power of state governments. So if you have to write about Brutus, be sure to mention these 2 clauses. Brutus notes that only small republics have historically worked, such as ancient Greece and Rome, and that America was too large and diverse, and therefore the competition among representatives would establish a system where nothing gets done. So we covered Federalist number 10, and my students read the highlights of it, where Madison argues that a large republic has the opposite effect and was exactly the solution to protect the rights of the people. In our first lesson, we recovered the theories of democracy, so I'm not going to go over these again, but feel free to hit pause or write them down if you didn't watch that video. But for now, remember that Madison in Federalist number 10 wrote about how a large, diverse republic with competing interests would ensure that no faction would gain a monopoly on power, and that a balance of interests would have to be reached, ultimately serving the public good. And this is very much in line with the pluralist theory of democracy. Whereas Brutus is obviously anti-pluralism, arguing that states contain people with mostly shared interests, and therefore most of the governing should be done at that level. This debate, especially as the size and scope of the national government has exploded over the years, is still a central issue in our political landscape today, as today's Republican Party, for the most part, has argued, like Brutus, that the national government is too big and more power should shift back to the states, something that we will look at later in our lesson on politics. So what compromise was made to put the anti-federalist minds at rest? It was the addition of a Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution, one that would protect the people from national government infringements on their liberties. And while many states had already ratified the Constitution, the Federalists agreed to the Bill of Rights to convince Virginia and New York, the 2 big states that had been holding out, to jump on board. In 1788, the Constitution was ratified, and the following year, George Washington was sworn in as our nation's first president. 2 years later, the Bill of Rights were ratified by the states. And these first 10 amendments will play a central role in our upcoming lessons. But before we look down the road, let's review. This principle of government states that power should be divided into 3 branches. Separation of powers. Which Federalist paper outlined the benefits of checks and balances and separation of powers? Federalist number 51. Powers that Congress has that are listed in the Constitution are known as enumerated powers. This clause allows Congress to stretch those powers. The Necessary and Proper Clause. This clause states that the U.S. Constitution and federal law take precedence over state laws. the Supremacy Clause. In Brutus number 1, the author feared these sections of the Constitution, 2 clauses. The Necessary and Proper Clause and the Supremacy Clause. In Federalist number 10, Madison is most in line with this theory of democracy, pluralist. Which contemporary party believes in a smaller federal government with more state responsibilities? The Republicans. And that's it. I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to subscribe, because up next we are going to look at federalism. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with foundational document analysis worksheet, lesson plans, quizzes, and much, much more are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just look for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy or click on the link below this video.